All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Duffy. I'm a member of the Forum Committee. Welcome to the Forum, and welcome to our featured speaker this morning, former State Senator Kiki Curls. She's going to address the topic this morning of the recently enacted federal infrastructure bill, a once in a generation national effort to put people to work on aging infrastructure all across the country. She's particularly going to focus on how that's going to impact our city and state. Kiki Curls, as I mentioned, formerly represented the part of the Kansas City area in Jefferson City, which is where I had the opportunity to work with her for a number of years, and also is currently commissioner at the State Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations in Jefferson City. So we will ask Kiki to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Kiki, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Good. Thank you. Michael, it's great to see you, Renee, and others. It is great to be here. Thank you all so much for inviting me. As Michael said earlier, I'm the former state senator from the 9th District here in Kansas City. I served 4 years previously in the Missouri House and a little over 9 years in the Missouri Senate. During that time, while I was in the legislature, which was almost 15 years, I served extensively on the budget committee. So it is interesting with all of this money coming to the state right now, whether it be this infrastructure money or the CARES Act money that happens to be coming, those would be things typically that would have kept me very, very busy at this time. So I'm happy to be here today. Of course, happy to talk about the new infrastructure bill and the money's coming to the state and what it also means to Missouri and to Kansas City. So today we're going to talk about the new federal infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law, as it's officially called. And as we know, this $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill was signed by President Biden last November with the hope of addressing critical infrastructure needs we have here in the country, as well as creating millions of jobs for Americans over the next 5 years. Right now in Missouri, of course, deciding how to allocate this money that's coming into our state is still a work in progress. There have been some first-year funding items for 2022 that have already been announced, which we'll go over a little bit later. But right now, they're still trying to figure out from the federal government, currently in certain areas of funding, ways in which they would be allowed, of course, to spend the money. So let's begin, of course, with why infrastructure is important. Because I think, for some folks, part of the issue is, oh, we're spending this money on infrastructure. We should be spending this money on people, which I don't disagree with in some ways, but all of these are interconnected and all of it is necessary, of course, for us to have a successful and strong economy. But a few years ago, the Brookings Institution had a very good article on why infrastructure matters and why it's important. And what that article basically said was that concrete, steel, and fiber optic cable are the essential building blocks of every strong and successful economy. And that basically roads, bridges, railroads, energy projects, water, broadband, building, and parks are a complex group of interrelated sectors that allow trade, they promote business, and they connect workers, of course, to jobs. But not only that, infrastructure also provides millions of jobs every year in our state here in Missouri, of course, and around the country. At the time of the article, Brookings stated that about 14 million jobs in the US were directly related to infrastructure. And that happened to include jobs like railroad engineers, truck drivers, airline pilots, laborers, et cetera. So when we talk about $1.2 trillion, And this infrastructure bill, it really is a big deal. It really is a once in a lifetime opportunity, certainly at least once in a generation investment, as Michael said earlier, on the part of the federal government and of course on the part of the American people. And it'll mean a lot here in Missouri as well as we move to rehabilitate and upgrade and modernize our current infrastructure program here in the state of Missouri. Okay, so here's an interesting fact for you, and I'll sprinkle these throughout the presentation, of course, over the next 40 minutes. But as we talk about transportation and transit in Missouri, so Missouri sees 62 million transit trips every year. And with that, trucks, planes, barges, and trains in Missouri move over 1 billion tons of goods every year, valued at more than $1 trillion. So for Missouri, in that we have traditionally been called the gateway to the West, we know that as far as transportation, whether it happens to be by road, by rail, by water, a river, we know that Missouri really is centrally located where many of these companies, of course, moved so much product through our state to get to from coast to coast. So this infrastructure bill really is important to us, specifically, of course, here in Missouri. So let's talk a little bit about the bill. The $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure law was signed by President Biden back in November. And it essentially, as we said earlier, provides funding for infrastructure over the next 5 years. It is the largest long-term investment in our infrastructure in nearly a century. And these are significant monies that are being allocated in various areas to try to help us mitigate our nation's crumbling infrastructure, and also, of course, to create jobs at a time that, of course, it's really critical. A huge portion of that money will go to roads and bridges. In that bill, they had $110 billion allocated for the repair, replacement, and the rehabilitation of roads and bridges around the country. $65 billion to rebuild the electrical grid, to put in new power lines and expand renewable energy. Here's another interesting fact. I shouldn't say fun fact, but Missouri and Kansas currently rank in the top 10 states for power outages. So when we talk about rebuilding the electrical grid and we talk about renewable energy, those are things that are important for us, both of us on each side of the state line here in Missouri and Kansas. So I'm looking forward, of course, to us getting our fair share, and hopefully over the next 5 years, it'll help mitigate some of that power outages that we tend to suffer, whether it happens to be from storm or other natural disaster, or just some of the grids, of course, blowing out. $66 billion is allocated to modernize and expand passenger rail, or Amtrak, also, and to improve freight rail safety and efficiency. $65 billion was allocated for broadband infrastructure to provide access to internet for 30 million Americans who don't currently have access. So I want to talk a little bit about broadband access, because in as much as we're in Kansas City, we are very spoiled. And I will tell you, when I went to the legislature in 2007, I was very naive in thinking that everyone had access to just news, information, global, everything. I was stunned to find out that there were many areas in rural parts of the state that had no cable TV, no DSL, no internet service, period. Some had very slow dial-up, but many did not have any access at all. And I will tell you that even now, it's very interesting, because there were even as of 2 years ago, there were still 20% of the state's population that did not have broadband access. Some of those may have had dial-up. There were another section or another sector of the population that didn't have any internet access. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in my role, of course, at the state, of many issues that were very important to me, this issue of broadband access, specifically for kids and education in school, was something that was also very important to me. $55 billion was allocated for water infrastructure to deliver safe drinking water to the 10 million households that lack safe drinking water in this country. All right, I will tell you that there's an issue we have here at the state with lead-based pipes throughout the state as well. The money that's being allocated for this water infrastructure, of course, is allocated, of course, to mitigate that across the country as well. Public transit, there was $39 billion that was allocated to public transit, which includes the modernization of buses, rail cars, and thousands of miles of rail track that are in need of replacement. $7.5 billion was allocated for electric vehicle use, okay, to build a national networks of electric vehicle charging stations across the US to meet the rising need, of course, of electric vehicles. But we're also talking about the importance of reducing emissions and improving air quality. And it certainly is one more way to create well-paying jobs over these next 5 years. So that's something, of course, that Missouri will also be a player in, electric vehicles. The nation's airports, okay? So the infrastructure law, of course, allocated $25 billion for the repair and maintenance of our nation's airports. So here's another interesting fact, that although modernization, aviation modernization, of course, was created here in the US, do you realize that there are no US airports that rank in the top 25 airports worldwide? There's not a single US airport that ranks in the top 25, even though the United States, of course, was the major player as we talk about aviation modernization and some of those other things. So I'm sure that was part of the impetus, of course, for the repair and maintenance of our nation's airport and to just improve our air system globally. We talk about airports. We also want to talk about the nation's ports, and $17 billion were allocated for ports to be able to strengthen our supply chain and waterways and to reduce bottlenecks and disruptions which have caused inflation. So here's an interesting fact. Here's a fun fact for you. Missouri has 1,050 miles of navigable rivers. We rank 10th in the country. So when we talk about the Missouri River and the Mississippi River and some of these other smaller rivers, clearly we rank 10th in the country of navigable rivers. And Missouri also has 17 river ports throughout the state, including St. Louis, which happens to be the third largest US inland port in the country. So those are a few fun facts, of course, related to our ports and airports. And so we're happy to see, of course, that, you know, we've taken this step in trying to improve many of those. So in a nutshell, those are some of the major expenditures that would be supported and provided by the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But clearly it's not an exhaustive list, as I'm sure many of us know, but it at least captures a snapshot of some of the main touch points, of course, of the legislation. So now let's talk about what this means for Missouri. Okay. So our infrastructure has suffered from a systemic lack of investment for many years. It's something that we tackled in the legislature repeatedly, almost every year. I mean, it was one of the major issues, infrastructure, of course, how we fund it. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave Missouri a C- on its infrastructure report card. So clearly there's work that needs to be done here in the state, which we've been well aware of course, for quite some time. The problem is, of course, finding funding to be able to fix many of those. We know that infrastructure needs, of course, are very expensive. And, you know, in the budget process, it was always trying to figure out what needs have to be met first, and then some of those other things are put on the back burner for later. So the funding coming down this pipeline is much needed as we move forward with needed repairs, upgrades, and modernization of our system that we need over the next several years. All right. As I stated earlier, you know, as far as funding and deciding how all of the money will be spent is still a work in progress at the state, as they're still receiving, of course, instruction from the feds, how certain monies in certain categories can be spent. However, we do know at this point that about $9 billion will be Missouri's share of the infrastructure monies that will be coming to the states over the next 5 years. So $9 billion, that's, you know, that's nothing to sneeze at. I will tell you that our entire operating budget for the state is about $28 billion. So receiving $9 billion over the next 5 years for infrastructure needs is something that's critically needed for us. And, you know, as a person that was in this role, of course, before, I understand the importance of this bill and what it means to us as well. So of that $9 billion, we also know that a lion's share of that money for the state, $6.5 billion, will go to repair our state's roads and highways. Interesting facts, according to MoDOT. So Missouri has the 7th largest highway system in the country, with over 33,000 miles of state highways, 7th largest. We also rank 5th in the country in interstate highway miles. So even though Missouri clearly is not in the top 5 or top 7 cities, we have an extensive amount of highways, roads, and bridges, of course, that have to be tended to. And mainly because we happen to sit so central, of course, in the United States, that we have a lot of traffic, of course, that goes through our state in transit. But in that, we rank 5th with the largest highway system in the country, and I'm sorry, 7th with the largest highway system in the country, and 5th in interstate highway miles. We rank 45th in the country in state revenue received per mile. And I will tell you that that's mainly because that Missouri does not have a dedicated funding source for transportation. Most of our roads and bridges are being repaired, and that funding is provided by the gas tax here in Missouri, of which we have one of the lowest gas tax in the country. That was also one of the areas of contention at the state for many years, how we began to raise revenue to be able to repair and fix and modernize our roads and bridges. Until October, because that's when the new law was passed, the Senate bill was passed, which increases the gas tax here in Missouri, our gas tax was about 17 cents per gallon, our state gas tax. I will tell you that the national average, I think, is somewhere around 50 cents. So legislation was passed, I believe it was a year ago, for an increase in gas taxes. It's something that we had fought over many years at the state. The new gas tax increase began in October of 21, and it is set to increase by 2.5 cents every year until 2025. So at that point, so now, of course, we're benefiting from a gas tax of 19.5 cents. So at 2025, I think they're expecting that we'll have, at the completion of it, maybe $500 million in revenue. You know, there's a small portion of that that goes to the cities and to the counties. And then the rest of it, of course, will go towards transportation. Other fast facts, 25% of our roads here in Missouri are considered to be in poor condition. 27% of our roads are considered to be in mediocre condition. 18% are in fair condition, and only 30% of our roads in Missouri are considered to be in good condition. So we struggle when we talk about roads, we talk about modernization, we talk about rehabilitation, we talk about repair of our roads. I will tell you, of course, fixing our roads is very expensive. I believe it's I believe it's about $130,000 a mile to resurface a state highway, and I believe it's about $180,000 per mile to resurface an interstate highway. So we're talking about lots of money. Obviously, you know, this money that we're able to get from the feds currently in this bill will be extremely helpful as we try to meet our needs, critical infrastructure needs, over the next several years. Good news for Kansas City area. I will say that in as much as MoDOT typically has a very long list of projects that need to be fulfilled, with this new money coming to the state, MoDOT has already suggested at this point that there are a few projects that will be on the list with this new money. In this area, they happen to be in Jackson County, repairing I-70 from downtown to I-435. In Clay County, repairing and doing work on the I-29 and I-35 corridors. And in Lafayette County, which of course is to the east of Kansas City, which includes, you know, cities and towns such as Lexington and Higginsville, repairs to roads at I-70 and Missouri Highway 131. So lucky for us here in Kansas City, MoDOT is already preparing, of course, with this money to be able to fulfill a few projects here that have been on the list, of course, for quite some time. So that's good news for us. So in this first year funding for 2022, it's already been announced that there will be a $1.25 billion allocation for the state's roads and highways, which includes, of course, those projects here in the Kansas City area. And again, it'll receive about $6.5 billion total for roads and highways over the next 5 years. Okay. So let's talk about bridges. You've heard me talk about highways, roads, and bridges. So this bill gives Missouri $484 million for bridge replacement and repair. Missouri throughout the state has a very critical need for repair or replacement of many of our bridges, okay? Missouri has about 10,400 bridges with an average age of 48 years. Now keep in mind, when many of these bridges were built, they were designed to last about 50 years. So we're at the crux of all our crumbling bridges and infrastructure needs in that area. 60% of our bridges are beyond their intended life. All right. 60% of our bridges are beyond our intended life, which is scary. You know, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation, 2,190, so almost 2,200 bridges in Missouri are rated poor by the Federal Highway Administration criteria. So we're struggling in the repair and maintenance of our bridges. 963 of those bridges are weight restricted, which means they're unable to carry normal traffic for which they were originally intended. So I'll say, I'm not sure how many of the folks here on the call ever travel to outstate Missouri. But I will tell you that many of the roads and bridges in those areas are in severe disrepair in many of those areas. Enough where it is quite scary going across a one-lane bridge, which we don't experience much here, of course, in urban areas or in Kansas City. So those infrastructure needs, as we talk about bridges here in Missouri, are much needed. $97 million has been allocated for the first year funding in 2022 to rehabilitate, construct, and modernize our state bridges. We're expected to receive, of course, $484 million over the next 5 years. Those are critical needs, of course, that we continually addressed in the legislature. And it's good to see that these additional monies, of course, will be helpful in this regard. So let's talk about water. Something we take for granted here because Kansas City and St. Louis both have very good water nationally, okay? But the state has a very critical need in repairing our water infrastructure and removing lead pipes around the state. So when we talk about lead pipes, you know, lead was the material in the early 1900s, which was most desirable choice, of course, for installing water lines. And I think it was because it was more pliable, maybe than steel. Those lines, of course, were easier to install. However, over the years, we now understand how damaging and dangerous, of course, potential lead leaching into the water system is potentially to young kids. So about 30 years ago, the EPA, of course, the federal government banned lead pipes because of concerns about lead leaching into the water supply in certain areas and its exposure to children. Even though the federal government banned lead pipes over 30 years ago, many states' water systems have yet to replace them, including Missouri. So as for Missouri, we have some of the highest numbers of lead pipes in the country. It's estimated that there are about 330,000 lead service lines throughout our state. And the other interesting thing is Missouri Department of Natural Resources doesn't currently keep data on lead service lines or potential lead leaching into the water system, as many states don't, but I will tell you that that will change soon, as the EPA is now requiring that all states keep data starting in 2024 on the effects of lead service lines and data on lead in the water system. So in as much as that's something that we take for granted here in urban areas, we have very extensive water systems. Many areas of the state do not. So as we talk about water, that water is a basic human need. And to potentially think about lead in the water systems around many areas of our state is a very critical issue, of course, to us, generally as adults, but certainly, of course, to kids. The first year funding for water infrastructure is $147 million. And that money will be used to remove lead pipes and improve water infrastructure. The allocation, of course, again, is $866 million over the next 5 years in Missouri. How are we doing on time? Okay, it's about 10:30. Airport infrastructure. So let's talk about that. Missouri will get about $246 million over the next 5 years to improve airport infrastructure. And that money will be used to repair runways, taxiways, airport-owned towers, terminal development projects, and house and noise reduction projects. In addition, $5 billion in discretionary funding is available to apply for Missouri to be able to address more aging infrastructure needs, expanding accessibility for those with disabilities. That money can be used for energy efficiency and airfield safety. Another fun fact regarding airports here in Missouri. Missouri has 121 public use airports, including 36 that are business capable, according to MoDOT. So, in as much as we think about our major airports, of course, here in St. Louis, of course, in Springfield, a smaller one in Columbia, there are 121 public use airports around the state. And many of those will, of course, benefit substantially from some of this money. $14.3 million has been allocated for 2022 for airports in the greater Kansas City area, including, now that includes 2 smaller airports in Kansas, the 3rd district. But Missouri will get $246 million over the next 5 years. So we are happy, of course, to be able to see that Kansas City has specifically been listed in the allocation for this coming year for airports in our area. And so that'll be great. That'll be $14 million well spent as well. So let's move to public transportation. Missouri will get around $674 million over the next 5 years to be able to improve healthy, sustainable options for public transportation. 32%, so that's 1 in 3 of our transit vehicles here in the state are past their useful life. All right, so when we happen to see in our areas buses that are aging, older buses that are past their useful life, we'll be able, of course, to be able to access some of these monies available. That will also allow public transit to replace, rehabilitate, or purchase new buses. It'll allow them to purchase related equipment and to construct bus-related facilities while moving toward green energy and reducing harmful emissions. So for Kansas City, let's talk about that. You know, we have ATA, of course, you know, our bus system and our zero fare system we have currently. But KCA here in our area has already expressed that the money given to them will go mainly toward 4 things. One of those happens to be for better roads and additional bus stops. The money will go toward electric vehicles. 65% of their current fleet is still natural gas. They would provide upgrades to their KCATA facility, construction projects that they have had on their waiting list for a while, waiting to, of course, to be able to obtain funding for. But the largest expenditure, what they appear most excited about, is a bi-state fast transit bus route. So I think many of us know that KCATA, even though it's called Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, has a bi-state board that, of course, includes Missouri and Kansas. And one of the initiatives that they are wanting, of course, to use this money for is bi-state fast transit bus route between Missouri and Kansas. KCATA is very busy, as we know. Here's an interesting fun fact regarding ATA. It serves more than 14 million people every single year. And it takes 34,000 trips every day, transporting folks throughout our public transportation system to and from work, from home, jobs, and entertainment. So ATA, of course, is a much needed resource. We know how much public transportation means to those of us here in the city. 14 million people a year and 34,000 trips a day is extraordinary. And it's something, of course, that they should be applauded. So next, we've talked about transportation, we talked about airports, we've talked about ports. So let's go back to this issue of internet and broadband. And as I said earlier, this is something that I feel very strongly about and did in my years in the legislature. So Missouri will receive about $100 million to expand access to high-speed internet to the areas of the state that most need it. Okay. As I said earlier, Missourians without internet access has always stunned me. I mean, this was one of the things in the legislature that I think I was most surprised at. You know, of course, I said I came to the legislature, I was completely naive on education, technology, all of that. So in as much as I would think that maybe some parts of the state may not have as great internet as Missouri, I wasn't really aware at that time that there were areas with no internet capability whatsoever. So as I said, as of 2 years ago, according to Missouri Department of Economic Development, there were still 1.26 million people, which is 20% of the state's population, that didn't have access to broadband internet. All right. So that's no high-speed internet, no cable TV, no DSL, any of that. You know, of course, some of them had dial-up, but it was still stunning for me that we still had people around the state that were on dial-up. And to think that even those folks that had access to dial-up, there was still a certain other portion of the population here in the state that had no internet access at all. So as I said earlier, that's mostly in rural parts of the state. Up to 2 years ago, there were still 24 counties throughout the state that had no broadband service. 24 entire counties had little or no broadband service. You know, here in urban areas, I'm going to say that we take so much for granted, whether it happens to be world news, whether it happens to be research, as I said earlier, even education. But around the state currently, there were 23%, so that's almost a quarter of the Missouri students that still lack reliable internet access. That's one of the areas, of course, that pains me. You know, I think of when I was younger, I will say that I think I was in middle school when our neighborhood had first gotten cable television, you know? So when I'm thinking about folks not having access to CNN or MSNBC or even Fox News for some, or just all of those other programs that go far beyond just your local news channel and the service and the programming that they are providing. What a limited world many of the folks live in when they don't have access to the same information that we do. I will say that for those with internet, we still rank in the bottom 5 in the country for low cost internet access. You know, I believe there are about 26, I think 20 something, I think it's 26 carriers statewide that provide internet service, but many of the counties that even have internet service have one service provider. So of course that eliminates competition. You can imagine in some areas how it's not as cost effective for some of those families to be able to afford. You know, some of that is the same problem here in Kansas City, I will say as well. Over the last couple of years, we've done a lot better around the state with installing broadband cable. So we now rank 32nd nationally for internet coverage, but that's still not great. It's still in the middle to low compared to other states. So I guess instead of 80%, we now have about 83% of those that have access to broadband. but we still have over 350,000 people here in our state that don't have internet connection at all. You know, I'm going back to this. I've talked about it a lot the past few minutes, but those Missourians, of course, without broadband are at a major disadvantage in education. You know, think about the amount and the number of curriculum and tutorials that happen to be internet-based. Think about what that meant for schooling for our kids this year with this COVID, with the pandemic we have going on. But they're at a disadvantage looking for job opportunities. They're, you know, disadvantaged getting health information and services virtually that some of us really take for granted. We talk about the disadvantages in accessing news and information or accessing government services. You know, right now, as an example, the COVID test, you know, the government is saying they'll mail every household 4 COVID tests. You are able right now to only do that online. I said, think about all of those families around the state that don't have access, will not have a way, of course, to be able to order those tests, as many of us, we take for granted, you know, every day. And really just preparing for tomorrow's workforce. You know, the tutorials that we happen to find online that prepare us for jobs. You know, we're thinking about this call right here, just access to information, of course, that other folks don't have. So I will say that in as much as it's a problem around the state, in the urban community, and I can speak for myself and African-American community, we still have a problem even in urban communities with having access to internet. It's not that we don't have cables available, it's just the affordability of it. I will say that a few years ago, I think around the country, and I think it posed true here in Kansas City as well, that in urban minority or lower income communities, only 50% of those communities, 50% of those households have access to a computer, and only 50% of those have access to internet within their home. So in as much as, you know, broadband access is important, this legislation is also supposed to help with an affordability factor. You know, they're saying that the legislation will also help lower prices for internet service to help close the digital divide so that more Americans can afford internet access in their homes. And I will say personally, that is something, even here in Kansas City, of course, that I feel strongly about. So I'm happy to see that. Now, on a lighter note here in Kansas City, I can say that we're in Missouri's top ranking cities in the area of wired broadband access and affordability. So Missouri's top ranked cities are Kansas City, Grandview, Independence, and St. Louis, with Kansas City ranking the highest with the best internet accessibility in the state. Imagine that. Woohoo. Okay. As I said earlier, however, we also know that that's not necessarily the case for everyone, but it's certainly something that we can be thankful for, and something that we certainly don't need to take for granted. We talk about it.
We're ready now to move on to the questions that you may have for Kiki Curls about infrastructure. Looks like first up with a question is Richard Thompson.
How do we get these small town and rural voters you were referring to vote for candidates that will, you know, provide money to get them internet access rather than voting for candidates that will keep the queers from getting married, you know?
Richard, that's an interesting question. A very political question, for one for which I don't necessarily have an answer to. Here's what I will say. I will say that politics begins at home, and people see politics through the lens of their personal life experience. I'm trying to answer this as politically safe as I can, in that it's been very difficult for me, even with legislators from rural parts of the state, that I feel are very good people inherently. And it amazes me how much we differ on many issues, that that I see is very detrimental either to them or their constituency in their district. But I will tell you, people don't always see things the way we do. Maybe for some, you know, maybe I shouldn't say some don't miss things they've never had. I'm sure everyone would love to have reliable internet service. But until you have been able to experience how eye-opening having access to the rest of the world is, I don't know that some folks fully appreciate what it means not to have it. So I'm trying to answer that with some political correctness, but that is an age-old question that some of us have, not necessarily just related to internet access, but to many other social service issues as well. And that's an interesting question for one which I don't have a great answer for right now.
Let's go on to the next question from Evelyn Maddox.
Yes, thank you. Hi, and thank you for your public service, Kiki.
Thank you.
I have one question, but it has two very related parts. We in Kansas City really need fast transportation across towards St. Louis. And one reason, Kiki, is that we need to go to Jeff City once in a while.
I agree.
And at the time, it's a 2-hour drive, you know, and the committee meetings are early in the morning. You may be there till late at night. But anyway, so the question is, any signs there are monies for fast rail transportation across the state? But then the second part is, you mentioned St. Louis is already planning a bi-state bus transit system. And would that be?
No, that's KCATA.
Oh, KCTA. Okay.
KCATA is preparing, right, for bus transit between Missouri and Kansas.
Yeah, okay, because I thought you said St. Louis and I was thinking Illinois. Then there's just the one question about any chance for fast transportation towards St. Louis, including Jeff City.
Right. So I will tell you that in my years in the legislature, that is something, of course, that we've talked about over the years. It has not gained as much ground, probably because of the expense of it, knowing that we have so many other infrastructure needs and transportation needs that needed to be addressed, folks thought before. It is something that I'm sure, you know, will still be in discussion, and probably something that'll be more in discussion, you know, as we talk about some of this money as well. So it is something that has been discussed. I don't know that it's on the table currently right now with this particular allocation of money from this bill.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next question is from Lon Swearingen. Lon?
What I'd like to know is what will happen with all this money coming in? Will there be training for minorities and others to be able to do some of those jobs?
Well, Lon, I will tell you that initially, when the bill was proposed and supported by the president, it contained a lot of programming for workforce development and training, among other things. I will tell you, as the bill, as many times, you know, it's what happens in the legislative process. As it had gone through the process, many of those things were eliminated, so that this bill now does not include some of those things that you're talking about that we know are super important, but it's specifically for infrastructure needs. Now, granted, we're going to need people to be able to work those. So I think that there are going to be other monies available through the CARES Act money at the state that will try to address some of the training that will be associated with some of these other jobs as well, workforce training. So probably not with this money, but probably with the COVID CARES Act money that'll be coming to the state as well will be used to address some of that.
Okay, I hope it works out.
Right, I do too. I will tell you that the governor has stated that the workforce training right now is one of his priorities for the coming year. And I'm sure it's because of the windfall that the state will be receiving, of course, from, you know, CARES Act or COVID-19 money. And so I do know that that is something, of course, they will have increased funding for this year.
All right,
Okay,
thanks.
thank
I
you.
don't see anybody else's hand up, so I'm going to jump in with a question of my own.
Sure.
Kiki, you mentioned that a lot of the money is going to be used for water infrastructure. And one of the big issues, of course, we have in Kansas City is separating our water sewer systems, which is
Right.
just a backbreaking amount of debt that the EPA has imposed upon Kansas City, which has in turn led to great rises in the water bills, which are
Oh,
affecting housing costs, particularly
right.
in low-income areas of the city. So is there anything in this bill that will help abate some of this problem, the cost of separating our sewer system in Kansas City?
You know what, Michael, I'm not certain. I'd love to be able to say yes, because we do have very significant water bills. I will tell you that a few years ago at the state, I did a mini poll in different areas of the state of the water bills. And I will tell you that Kansas City had the highest water storm sewer rates in the entire state. So that is something that I was very sensitive to. I think that's probably a question that we need to pose more for our city council folks or for the mayor, as they are also accessing additional monies. Clearly, Missouri has money that's allocated for water infrastructure that I hope as well would be used toward the EPA mandate as well. So.
Okay, thanks. Joe, I saw you had your hand up a moment ago. Do you still have a question?
Yes, good morning, Kiki.
Good morning.
Hey, I had there's been a history at times where a Republican kind of dominated legislative bodies might resist packages or relief funds and things if they come from a Democratic administration. Is there any risk out there, danger of some of these things that might be coming from down the road for these things not being, being denied by Missouri?
So here's what I'll say. There's always a danger. Some of the most distressing scenarios that I had, of course, at the state was when there would be federal monies coming down in the state, the Republican either administration or the legislature, which of course is a supermajority, then refused it. And I'm like, hey, guys, the money, it just means that the money goes to other states. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be spent, But I have not heard that issue in any type of concerning way. Right now, I will tell you that the budget process, they are preparing to use the CARES Act money that's coming down. I have not heard. I think right now we're excited about the money that we're supposed to get for infrastructure. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that that does not become an issue for some of the super conservative, folks in the legislature. Here's what I will say also, that in as much as the budget process is now preparing to use this money and that Missouri will get a windfall from both of those allocations, those that, even though there happens to be a super majority politically, you have a bunch of Republican moderates, and then you have the super conservative, a much smaller group of super conservatives that I would anticipate may at some point have some concerns about accepting the money. But I will tell you that as of right now, from most of the folks in the legislature, that has not been something that appears to be over concerning at this point in time. They are making preparations to use this money. So I'll say that without giving any promises down the road. But right now, they're very much revving up for using this money.
Kind of a related question, Kiki, is all of the money coming from the federal government going through the state government, or does some of it go straight from the feds to, let's say, Kansas City, for example?
I think that, oh, Michael, that's a good question. Of course, my research, of course, from the state was basically the money coming through the state. I do know that some of that money that is coming through the state would be coming to the city and the counties. I don't think that money would be going directly to those other municipalities. I think it's coming through the state first as a pass-through, but don't quote me 100%. I think that that's the case, but I'm not absolutely sure. I'd have to check on it, but I'm happy to get back with you on it. I think that that's the case that it comes to the state.
And which federal agency is going to administer this?
That's another interesting question. Okay. Um, so
Certainly,
I don't know the answer to that.
the DOT's got to be in the middle of it, but
Of course, Department of Transportation, of course, you've got EPA, that happens to deal with the water. You've got, as you said, USDOT. So I know that there are several of the different federal agencies that are, of course, involved in this. I'm not sure specifically which agency will administer the funding. So, and it could be that it's several, or it could be that, so I'm not sure, but I'm happy to check on that.
okay. And I'll, unless anybody else has a question, I want to follow up on Lon Swearingen's question about job training. Sort of a related question: are there provisions in the bill that assure that work done in the Kansas City area will be performed by Kansas City area workers, and the sizable share of the business will go to minority and women-owned enterprises? Basically, the work that's being done here, is it going to benefit Kansas City businesses and workers? Are there provisions in the bill that address that point? Do you know?
Michael, I don't think there are provisions in the bill that address that. Hopefully, it'll be incumbent upon Kansas City, the city of Kansas City, as we receive this funding, and for those in this area, to make sure that we are providing access to women and minority businesses, that we are attempting first to use folks locally that would be doing this work. That is something that has been an issue for quite some time for many of us also. But I will tell you that of course, it's a very large bill. I don't have any indication at all that is actually included in the federal bill. That would be something more likely we would have to ascertain and make sure of locally.
Okay, thank you. Kiki, I know that we kind of cut you off in the middle of some of your material
No.
here. Is there a final point you wanted to throw in here?
Yeah, no. I was just going to say, I'll just very briefly state really quickly that, of course, Missouri will receive about $99 million over 5 years to build the network of electric vehicle chargers throughout the state. I think that's the last little fact that I had. And we'll have additional opportunity to be able to apply for $2.5 billion in grants for electric vehicles. But I want to thank you guys, of course, for having me. And Michael, you know how wonderful you have been to me over the years and how much you have impacted my work in Jefferson City. And I am very grateful and thankful to you, as you know. And I want to thank you all, of course, for inviting me today. I was happy to be here. And if I can be of help, in the future, please let me know.
Oh, thank you so much, Kiki. I really appreciate you spending time with us this morning.
Of course.
With that, we'll conclude the forum, and join us next Sunday for Mayor Lucas's annual address to the forum. I say annual, that reminds me, I think somebody will have to help me again on this. I believe we're coming up to about the 50th year of the forum.
80 years.
80? Oh my goodness.
Oh, wow.
Okay, well, that's even more impressive. Now, we haven't had the mayor talk to us for all 80 of those years, but I think it's been at least 30 where the mayor has come to join us. So looking forward to that. Again, Kiki Curls, thank you so much. This has been
Absolutely.
very informative. Clearly, you've done your homework. So thank you. Thank you so much for giving us so much information. With
Okay.
that, we'll adjourn, and thank you all for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next week.
All right. Thank
Good
you.
morning.